Our message for this morning is based on Acts chapter 14, verse 8 to 18. Let's read those verses along with the audio Bible by David Suchet.
In Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them.
Having to flee from Iconium, Paul and his companions next proclaimed their message in the town of Lystra, roughly 30 kilometres to the southwest. Lystra, like city in Antioch, had been made a Roman colony by Augustus in 25 BC, about 70 years previous. It was a strategic base for Rome. To defend against marauders from the Taurus Mountains, it was a garrison city with a strong military presence. And all the way from Antioch, Syria to Lystra, there was a military road about 150 kilometres long connecting the two Roman colony cities. Iconium, where the missionaries had just come from, was just off the track, but presumably because of the Jewish community there and the synagogue, Paul and Barnabas considered it was worth the visit. Today's stop, Lystra, seemingly didn't have a synagogue, which might mean that there was less than 10 Jewish men in the city, so clearly their interactions and their mission experience would be quite different compared to the predictability of the Jewish response. This was a little bit of an unknown. Also, Paul would have known Greek, Aramaic, probably some Latin, and I guess a few bits and pieces of other local languages too. He was obviously quite gifted with languages and an able writer, but we can be pretty sure he doesn't know Lycaonian. And so communicating the gospel message in Lystra wouldn't just be so straightforward as it had been previously. Luke tells us, to begin with, in verses 8 to 10, that as Paul preached, probably in Greek, that he caught the attention of a lame man, lame from birth, who was clearly soaking in the message, and from the expression of his face, the look in his eye, it was obvious to Paul that he had faith in Jesus, who Paul preached about. Faith to believe that this message was true, that Jesus was real, that the Jesus Paul preached of did indeed have the power to forgive sins, transform lives, and heal the broken. So Paul fixed his gaze on the lame man and told him to stand. Without any hesitation, the man sprung to his feet and began to walk around for the first time in his life. It was a miracle, one that got the clear attention of the crowds. Now when it comes to Jesus and the apostles and their miracles, perhaps especially in a context like this, the common explanation of the modern skeptic and disbeliever is that they were simple tricks and cons for simple-minded people. They peddled their message like the tinctures and elixirs of travelling salesmen, medicine men and con men, preying on the poor, the desperate, the simple-minded. I suppose then that puts Jesus up there with the greats, the other famous medicine shows that have changed history and shaped the world we live in. Famous household names like, Doc Scott, the Hat of All Caravan, Chief Thundercloud and Pegleg Sam. Yeah, that explains it. No, the whole purpose in Luke recording this miracle, like with pretty much every recorded miracle, was because there was no way that this could have been a trick. The man who was lame certainly could not have been a plant in the crowd. He was local. And he certainly wasn't a faker either, because he was lame from birth. So even the greatest skeptic in town, this is clearly a miracle. In their native tongue, Lycaonian, the Lystrans burst into shouts of ecstatic praise to God for this miracle. Perhaps at the start anyway, to Paul and Barnabas, it might even have looked like they were giving glory to Christ or speaking in tongues, their native tongue. It would have been bad enough if they had just planned to sacrifice to Zeus and Hermes to thank them for the miracle, but needless to say, Paul and Barnabas were absolutely horrified when they realised the people were convinced that Barnabas was Zeus and Paul was Hermes in the flesh, come down from Mount Olympus to pay them a visit. Liam Neeson plays a convincing caravan entertainer. He does a good Aslan, and he can put on a fairly scary telephone voice. But not even the big man from Ballymena can pull off a convincing Zeus. So how did the Lystrans ever confuse Barnabas with Zeus and Paul with Hermes? And how do we understand the response? Do we simply side with the arrogant skeptic and just write them off as primitive and superstitious? Well, to start with, it wasn't totally out of the blue. Local legend told of earlier occasions when the gods, particularly Zeus and Hermes, had visited humans, taking on human likeness. Ovid, a Roman poet from the time of Emperor Augustus, about 70 years previous, tells the story of an old couple from the region who entertained two strangers, only to discover after that they had entertained gods unawares and were rewarded for their hospitality. It was a common ancient concept for cultures that had a high view of hospitality, as well as a high view of the gods and angels as well. Might sound superstitious, ridiculous, but sadly, I'm fairly confident that most people today, Christians too, have a view and practice of hospitality and entertaining strangers not from the truth of God's word, but, likewise, mostly based on myth. Today's educated and highly intelligent Western culture chooses not to entertain strangers and not to pick up hitchhikers because of urban myths that the hitcher or the stranger or the neighbour is really some kind of devil trying to get into your home. Today's culture still has myths, and generally speaking, for most people, today's gods still harness the lightning, albeit on a microscopic level. Or their gods are affected by lightning. They're in our homes, they are our homes, our cars, and so all the more reason, I suppose, not to be hospitable. Why risk the threat to our own little Mount Olympus? Really, when it comes down to it, why should the worship of one false god be any more acceptable than the worship of another? Why should something that's been considered superstitious to be less acceptable than something that's considered to be slightly more highbrow? In the old movie, no longer showing obviously, The Gods Must Be Crazy, a Coca-Cola bottle falls from the sky and is revered as a magical object by the apparently primitive Bushmen. As Westerners we might mock, but Coca-Cola only got to Africa because it was first a fetish in the West. Is it any more wrong to be devoted to the bottle itself than the contents of the bottle? Is there any difference between adoring the mirror as an object and adoring the object in the mirror? What's the difference? Part of the reason perhaps why we consider such beliefs as primitive is because of the popularised misconception that gods were actually invented to explain such events as lightning storms, tornadoes, volcano eruptions and tsunamis. Though anthropology, that's the study of people groups, their behaviours and their beliefs, has shown it to be really more the opposite. Warring peoples had similar gods. Jupiter to the Romans, Thor to the Scandinavians, Umpugandulo to the Bantu tribesmen, all wielding weapons of lightning, charging forward into blitzkrieg, lightning war. The warring champions and their so-called gods weren't born out of an ignorance of lightning. They were born out of a lust of its destructive power. All people, ancient, modern, we're all the same. We worship things we lust after. The fault is not on the object or the false god itself. The problem is, as has been famously said, man's heart, so to speak, is a perpetual factory of idols. Which is why after Paul and Barnabas tear their clothes in horror, protesting that they themselves were only men, calling the Lystrans to turn from what they literally describe as a shallow and empty view of God, Paul, who is wrongly believed to be Hermes, the divine messenger and revealer of the great god Zeus, goes on to reveal the character of the one true God. He is so much more than some blitzkrieg warrior, grasping for power and pushing to expand his control He is the one who already owns everything, because he is the creator of everything. He made the heavens, and the earth, and the sea, and everything in them. Paul explains in verse 16 that the reason why he hasn't purged them from the face of this world, like you might expect some tribal god to do, is because he is patient, and because he is kind. He doesn't strike your crops with lightning from heaven because you fail to appease him. Verse 17, don't you know what he sends down from the heavens? Rain for your crops in their season. Because he is kind and because he is faithful. He has showered you with good things. Just stop for a moment and see that as you try and please or appease God with your offerings and your sacrifices, that as you try and serve him to get the shallow things that you want, can't you see that all along he has been serving you? He is the God who has been putting food on your table and filling your heart with joy. At the core of the gospel, the true Christian message is the truth. Not that you served God, but that God has been serving you. Not that you loved God, but that God loved you before you even knew him. And the most crucial thing, the most unbelievable thing, much more unbelievable than any crazy ancient mythology, is that your relationship with God, your being rejected forever and condemned, or accepted, doesn't come down to anything you did or gave up or sacrificed, but down to a single sacrifice that God made for you. When the servant king came down to this world, not to be worshipped and adored and be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. The people of Lystra weren't any more ignorant or superstitious or simple-minded than anyone else before or after them. It's just that the human heart is an idol factory, and the human heart is selfish. So naturally, the human heart can only conceive of a selfish thought or a selfish gene or a selfish God. Selflessness? It doesn't make any sense to us. A selfless God doesn't make sense to selfish people. After all, the disciples spent 3 years with Jesus. They still had trouble believing. Surely there's something I can do, something I can offer, something God actually needs from me. Ultimately, my selfish heart searches for something that will leave God indebted to me and my selfish lusts and cravings. Would you tolerate that from any other relationship? You and I both know that if we had a friend or a child that got into a relationship with another person who only wanted them for what they could get out of them, if we were convinced that at heart all the flowers or gifts or flattering words were simply some means to an end, not out of a heart of genuine respect and care and love, then we of course would be concerned. We would call it a shallow, selfish, toxic relationship. So why would God tolerate that from you? He doesn't want your service, or your sacrifices, or your faithful church attendance, your daily time of prayer and devotion in and of itself. He wants you, your heart, your soul. He wants to be your rescuer and redeemer, your saviour and king who you love and adore. He wants actions and words spoken for him out of a heart that has been changed by him to live for him, because he first loved you and gave himself for you. I suppose for now we're leaving Paul and Barnabas in a bit of a cliffhanger. For the Lystrans it's unresolved. God has been patient, Paul reminds them. That's why the world carries on. If you've been rejecting him, then he's been patient with you too. Every breath, every heartbeat is a gift of God's patience. Don't squander his patience. Be reconciled to God.